I went to art school at the age of 16, having really been expected to go into the sixth form. I took off in a sense then that I started making models, and there used to be what's called a sketching permit for Grimsby docks, where I could cycle down there and just look at and draw trawlers and some of the machinery that you found down on the docks. And I sort of came back and started making little models. It's got a bit damaged now, but this one is made as a boat would be made, with ribs and a keel. This one is a kind of a solid thing out of a little piece of, well, it looks like pine to me. I made a scale violin. Did the careful measuring from my mother, had a violin, and created this. As far as at that time I understood violins would be made, separate front and a separate back and so on. During the 60s, that's when I started really doing sculpture. In Grimsby, in about, I think it was 1962 or 3, a church was being demolished in one of the main shopping streets called Freeman Street. And I saw one day that there were lumps of stone, decent sized pieces, if you can imagine that kind of size. And I thought, and I'd never done any stone carving, and I went up to the guy who was in charge of, they'd been doing the demolishing, and said, any chance I could buy a piece of stone? And he said, well, you can, but how are you going to get it to wherever you live? It won't go in your Morris Minor, will it? And the guy said, I can deliver that one piece for you, but if you may as well have a lorry load. The lorry load was 8 pieces of stone. And he brought them and dropped them outside the house, much to the amusement of the neighbours. But it meant that I, for the first time ever, had experience of stone carving. And really that was my first serious introduction to three-dimensional work. I then moved on to, of course, did clay modelling and plaster mould making and so on, working in plaster. I then started welding, first of all in steel, but then I discovered copper, started working in copper. And about that time also was given some pieces of wood, and that was really the first time I'd ever done any wood carving. Once I'd become interested in wood carving, I think that became my go-to. It's changed a little bit over the years, partly to do with doing commissions and so on. Around about 1964, I met an architect in Grimsby called Gosney, who had seen some of my work in a little exhibition and liked it, and asked if I would be interested in doing a public commission. This was my first one, and it was to be for a very large family group in Immingham. It was controversial at the time because it was large, but it was a mother and father with 2 children on their shoulders. They were naked, but the whole thing was, since it was so high up, is very blurred. But of course it was kind of thing that people wrote into the local press about and complained about. My mother kept all the newspaper cuttings. I also, a little bit later, 68 I think, did a multi-storey car park design, which is now in the news, or has been in the last year, because they're going to demolish it. And it was described at the time as being a good example of brutalist architecture. My designs, which are all based on the handbook of the car I had at the time, which is an Austin Cambridge estate car, old one. So there's carburettors and so on, in very simplified abstract designs in concrete for the columns. I remember many years ago reading something Henry Moore said. A lot of his abstract shapes were inspired by pebbles and pieces of stone that he picked up. I certainly have been inspired by an original piece of material. For example, the Reverie piece was made from 2 pieces of bog oak logs, which I'd been given. I'd had it for years and I'd really not known what to do with them. And it was when the project cropped up in, when was it, 2015, and York Art Gallery closed, and I was invited to produce something for that. I thought, what can I do with these 2 pieces? They were well, just logs, but of course uneven shapes. To some extent, the original shapes did inspire me to think of the final piece being in two sections, almost wrapping round each other. Needed quite a lot of carving to make it work, I thought. I'd had a piece of sycamore wood for quite some time and not really known what to do with it. But it was an awkward shape. It was only 10 centimetres wide and about 30 centimetres depth. In the end, I came up with this idea after doing some drawings and maquettes of a saxophone player, but of course inevitably had to be seriously stylised in order to fit into this very narrow piece of wood, or shall I say be carved out of a narrow piece of wood. Wood carving, of course, like stone carving, is a situation where you have a piece of material and you remove it to arrive at whatever is inside there. And the actual technique is simply to work like this. One of the things you have to be very careful with wood carving is to be fully aware of which way the grain goes. Sometimes, particularly with lime wood, which is although it is a hardwood, it's nothing like as hard as, say, oak or rosewood or something like that. You can do a certain amount by hand. There'll also be occasions when a rasp would be appropriate. Particularly helpful to, I find, for following a gentle curve round. The other work that I do is a direct opposite, where I build up a shape, usually in clay, then I make a mould, and then I have two distinct methods of creating copper sculptures. This is copper, sheet copper, which is how it looks when you first buy it. Has a shine to it, but it's also springy, so it has to be annealed. Take a section like, say, that much, and to anneal it just with heat. Now this means that it will be become very malleable. And so I've placed half a dozen pieces of random shaped copper pieces into the mould. The next job is to actually connect them up, to join them together with a low melt copper welding rod, which is this. What I'm doing is training the heat on the two copper pieces, but also on the rod. And the idea is trying to get them to end up melting at the same time. And the idea is that I do this exactly the same with this half, and then when both halves are done, join the two together. The other technique is from a wooden original. As before, it needs to be softened, in other words, annealed. Press the copper round. If necessary, I have to beat it with a round-headed mallet. Then I would drill holes that are going to link up with the next piece. So in this case, I'd probably put that one where that screw is. Maybe actually probably do it there. And use the same screw. All these screws would come out. I'd mark them where sections were, and then put rivets in to hold all these pieces together. And of course also you do end up with the wooden original with all these holes in. It can be seen as a finished piece of sculpture, I think. I've always felt drawing the basis of everything that I've been interested in. As a teacher in art school, that was primarily my job. I used to teach life drawing a lot. The concentration I find so essential, but also pretty well everything I've done has been the result of things that I've seen. And so I think of it as kind of observation and then interpretation. But I also think it's a little bit kind of almost like meditation, I think, in a way. I find it rather like that. But I have quite clear views about drawing for sculpture. And what I've often thought about was if you're doing a drawing, say during a life drawing session, for a piece of work that I then want to convert into a sculpture, female form, for example, how interesting it is that what we think of contours, in other words, the kind of edge of the subject, in a way, the contours don't really exist because you've only got to move your head a fraction to left and right, and those edges are different. And therefore, when I've been doing drawings for something that I want to convert into a three-dimensional, to a wood carving or a model, then I need to do lots and lots of drawings, preferably all the way round the figure. This, I think, is one of the reasons why I've found, for me, sculpture to be exciting. The fact that I need to know the subject all the way round it. I also do different types of drawing. Sometimes I do an initial idea, call it a preliminary drawing, or then I may do preparatory drawings when I'm actually starting to think of the work and how it's going to proceed. If it's to be a wood carving, where I'm going to cut wood off first, for example. And then I often do drawings en route. Whilst I'm working on something, I will maybe have to change direction slightly, so I'll maybe do drawings for that. So drawing for me has been pretty well fundamental to everything I do. Horses, well, it goes back a long way. When I was married, my wife was very keen on horses, and we actually bought a horse called Chalky. It was a grey, 20-year-old riding school horse, and it was Chalky that I rode once and even jumped a dike on it. The system of making, it's called the age, the system of making a horse do what you want it to, Chalky took no notice of it. And I kind of eventually slithered to the ground. And I've never been on a horse since. But that's where I started doing drawings of horses. But I became really interested in the horse shape and study of anatomy, and also used different themes, like Don Quixote on a horse, Don Quixote having fallen off a horse, and of course the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. I did become very interested in the idea of horses in action. I looked originally at some early horse prints, and I thought, they don't somehow look right to me, where they have front legs and rear legs stretched out. And I thought, that's not right, surely. And then discovered this famous book by Edward Muybridge. He was a photographer in the 19th century. He did a lot of stopped actions of people and animals, particularly horses, stopped them in action. So you had hundreds of shots of every bit of the movement. Having studied that, I felt I'd kind of got to know a little bit more about which feet end up on the ground at any time, or whether any do, angle of the head, the swish of the tail, all that I think can add quite a lot to movement. Even, I think, where the ears are. I've always had endless problems with horses' ears. I can never understand. I've really struggled with them. I've always had trouble working out where they develop from the horse's head from and how they can twist almost in a circle, which, you see, you don't necessarily consider if you're doing drawings of horses, but you certainly have to if you're doing a three-dimensional version. I think I'd like to question in my own mind the difference between abstraction and stylisation. So I feel that some of the recent pieces that are fragmented or made in pieces, I don't feel that they're abstract personally. I think I'm allowing myself to use a certain amount of stylisation, which I didn't have the urge to do years ago. I've always felt how difficult it is to enter into certain type of realism. What I've maybe described as slightly abstract pieces of mine, I like to think that there's a quite considerable element of understanding of the figure in them, rather than taking it to complete abstraction. Once I started teaching and started doing sculpture, of course then I did look at all kinds of masters in the past, names like Michelangelo, Leonardo and so on. I just thought how fantastic they were. In more modern times, I did become very interested in Henry Moore's work, and also one of his assistants called Ralph Brown, who I found really interesting, and found myself being quite influenced by the kind of texture that he used in some of his work. I hitchhiked to Venice with a friend. It just happened to be Biennale time. For the first time, I came across Marino Marini, Italian sculptor, who produced a lot of work to do with horses and riders. He did reach a stage towards the end of his life when he was abstracting them till they became almost geometric shapes. I found that fascinating. I had never myself had any urge to push mine anywhere near that degree of abstraction, but I do really find his things very interesting. I also liked Epstein, and another Italian sculptor I became very interested in, Giacomo Manziu. I liked his work very much. When I was 16 and just going to art school, I had a friend whose brother wanted to buy a painting of mine. But on the other hand, he had a clarinet he would like to swap with. We did a swap. So I acquired his clarinet. First time I'd ever had an instrument. When I went to Slade School, I joined a little jazz group, and we used to do gigs for the University College. I started then to teach myself to read music, bought a flute, and eventually started playing classical music. The concentration required reminded me of the concentration I felt I needed for drawing and sculpture. So that's why I saw a real similarity for me. As far as jazz is concerned, I have always enjoyed listening to and playing jazz. But what I especially enjoy doing, and what I still do regularly now with a guitarist friend, is jazz improvisation. And what I feel about what he and I do is that we are being creative every minute of the time that we are improvising. Whereas I'm not trying to compare particularly one type of music with another, but I personally see playing some of the classical music I have played as being interpretation of the composer's creation. Whereas when you're doing the improvisation that we do, we are creating every second of the time. We maybe work to some sort of a structure. This is how I find jazz improvisation to be so similar to a lot of the two-dimensional and three-dimensional work that I do. This building, when I bought it in 1996, was a derelict building that had been a dry cleaning warehouse. There was no staircase, just a ladder going up to some rather unsafe upper levels. In the year 2000, I applied for planning permission to turn it into a living accommodation, having previously created a little studio area where I had started making sculptures, and in fact where I made the 3 sculptures that are in Ripon Cathedral and the one in Chester Cathedral. So when I got planning permission, I treated the whole project really like as a creative project, and did loads of preparatory drawings for it, and made a balsa wood model, which I've still got, and then started the building work. I had actually done quite a lot of building work before I came to York, working with a professional, and so I had a fair bit of experience. And in this building, I had help from a builder friend in terms of underpinning and heavy concreting work, and having the roof lifted in order to create a headspace upstairs. But then quite a lot of it did myself, did all the plumbing and most of the electrics myself, did every bit of plastering in this building myself. Couldn't do it now, it's too strenuous. Plastering, incidentally, if you've not done any, is hard work right from the minute you collect the bag of plaster, which is quite heavy, and then when you do the mixing of it, stirring, waiting till it's right, then applying it. Everything about plastering I found quite hard work, and really makes your arms ache. But it was at the time I could not afford to do it any other way, and so I ended up with a building which, although it's been described as quirky, it was done just simply the way I wanted it to be, because I was going to be the one living in it, which I did for 14 years. During that time, did a lot of creative work as well. I think it was in around about 2009, I had the idea of carrying out a life-size version of Horse and Rider, which I'd never produced anything quite as large as that in wood. And the original piece, which is in builder's timber basically, although it's hollow, in loads of pieces, I used as a former, really, a basis to beat the copper round to create the copper version. And those two pieces are now permanent fixtures at Normanby Hall, and they are appropriately in the stables. I had been interested in doing a mother and child, which originally it was likely to be a commission for a church in Lincolnshire. But I moved to York during that time and was no longer able to continue with it. So the project was abandoned. When I came to York, I became a member of York Art Group. We had an exhibition in the King's Manor, and I was needed to come up with some work, and since I was on the committee, and so I had to rebuild this one piece, a mother and baby, and that eventually ended up in Ripon Cathedral. I was working on another version, which the following year also went to Ripon Cathedral, and the third one, the Pietà, was in the year 2000, went to Ripon Cathedral. I come here most days, usually quite early in the morning. I go to bed early, get up early, and really can't wait to get the day going because of so many ideas I want to sort of try and carry out. So I usually get here anywhere between 7 and 8 and work through till about 3 o'clock. I have an upstairs room which I call my drawing room. When I used to live here, it was where I had a TV and a little kind of desk and an armchair and so on. But now it is really where I do drawings. And so I've got all kinds of equipment for carrying out illustrations. I've done, over recent years, quite a lot of book illustration, working with 2 authors. I've really enjoyed doing that. Just a departure. And I like different challenges. I just like trying things, see if I can enjoy doing them. But really, I think I've actually come back to wood carving these days as the technique that I enjoy most. Except, of course, it's quite hard work. I end up with neck ache and back ache and arm ache and wrist ache, and it is actually quite strenuous work. I now do things to please myself, really, and what I was going to say, for my own amazement, rather than amusement, or both.